You're listening to Breaking the Silence, a podcast by Reach 10, where we are breaking the shame, silence, and fear that often surrounds sexuality, unwanted pornography use, and betrayal trauma, and helping you embrace your God-given sexuality with courage, compassion, and connection. I'm your host, Chriselle Simons. Welcome back, listeners. Today we are breaking the silence and kicking off our Ask a Therapist series with Rachel Denton. She is so awesome. We are so lucky to have her. She grew up in Portland and came to Utah for school. She graduated from the University of Utah with her master's degree in social work. Rachel worked with different agencies that specialize in pornography and addiction issues, including Fight the New Drug, until she had her adorable baby girl. Oh, she's the cutest. And decided to focus on her private practice. She's on the board for Reach 10, the nonprofit that makes this podcast possible. And today we're breaking the silence and answering the question, what are some examples of good boundaries and consequences if those boundaries are broken? So, Rachel, go ahead and say hi to our listeners, and then let's just get started talking about boundaries.
Yeah, well, this is a really important topic that I think that we use a lot, but we don't really know what it means. And so I'm glad that we're taking some time to break down a little bit of what boundaries are and what they may look like in a relationship and how to use them in a way that's helpful and not harmful to relationship.
Totally.
So, at the beginning, you asked to start with what are boundaries? Like, what is a boundary just in general? And I think a lot of times we, as our culture, talks about boundaries in a way that more feels like consequences. Like like an example might be, my boundary for you is, if you get angry with me, then I'm going to shut you out or shut down, or you're not welcome here, or whatever it may look like. When it's used in a way that is meant to manipulate or to, essentially create a consequence or punishment, then that's not really going to lead to a healthy, thriving relationship.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like more of a parent-child relationship as opposed to
Yeah,
like partners.
right. Yeah. Well, and I think that's actually an interesting point, because I think that as parents, parents give boundaries oftentimes poorly as well, because it's usually coming out of a place of either fear or anxiety from the parent themselves, of like, oh no, if I don't do this, my child's going to end up being a bad kid or not going to excel the way I would like them to, or whatever it may be. And so when boundaries are given and out of a place of anxiety, that tends to lead to, or anxiety or fear, that tends to lead to more, like I said, more manipulation type of boundary, or manipulative type of boundary, or just trying to coerce someone into doing a behavior, when in reality, like, we can't control other people. And so I think an important way to look at what a boundary is more of, one, what is it that's really going on here for me? I think that we often struggle to look at what's my stuff and what's either my partner's stuff or my child's stuff that I'm trying to set this boundary with. And how can I clearly tease those apart so I can see easier where a boundary needs to be laid?
I think that this is so beautiful because, yes, I would say that most often, as a whole, as a society, as a culture, we think of boundaries of just being like, here's the consequence that happens if you choose to act this way. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
boundary.
Right.
And what you're describing, I think, is so much different
Mm-hmm.
than what is typically accepted or thought of as boundaries. And I also love that you talked about, and I think we'll get into this a little bit more, of the motive behind the boundary that you're setting being incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it is coming from a place of fear or anxiety, then it probably won't ever lead to the outcome that you actually want in your relationship.
Right.
Whereas if it can be motivated in a place of, I would guess, like equal partnership, or creating safety in a relationship, or creating cohesiveness, or
Hmm.
like I'm trying to think of the right
Yeah.
word, then it can lead to probably the outcomes that you're actually looking for.
Hmm.
Would you is that right? Am I understanding what you're describing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because in the end, boundaries are meant to bring two people closer together.
Oh,
And I mean, like a well done boundary. That's what hopefully the outcome will be. But a lot of times when we give an outcome out of fear, or more of like a reactive boundary, then that's going to be incredibly disconnecting for both the person giving the boundary and the person receiving it. And
I
so,
think I think we need to say that again for the people in the back. I'd say it louder and shout it off the rooftops. That's so profound what you just said. When done correctly, boundaries create more connection and bring people
absolutely,
closer together.
absolutely,
Profound and
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's interesting because this is where we start to get a little bit more into the complexities of what does a boundary look like then? Because it's not like, I think a lot of people feel like I would love it if I had a script of this is a boundary I can read to my partner when they're doing something I don't like, or to my child. But in the end, it's less about what's said and more about, has this been, I think in two parts. One is this coming from a place that is regulated in me? And have I also taken the time to look at what is my role to play in the situation that we're in, and what can I personally be accountable for? Now, I know this gets a little bit tricky when we're specifically talking about something like pornography, because a lot of times, especially the person who is in a relationship with someone struggling with pornography, that person often can feel like, well, I have no part in this. And that's probably true, at least in their decision to look at pornography or to go down that path. But there are areas I think it's important for that partner to take a look at themselves of, how am I playing into this dynamic? Is there any way that I need to kind of mature a little bit around that, with the way I react to this? Or so once that, so we can get more into what that may look like in just a minute. But back to what I was saying before is, once that becomes very clear, then I think the boundary also becomes very clear,
Mhm.
where it's coming from a place of, I'm saying this because I respect myself and I respect you. And so it's important that we have this discussion so that we both know how to be in a relationship with each other.
Yeah, that's really, really beautiful, and I think it requires quite a bit of maturity
Hmm.
and self-reflection in order to even be able to approach the conversation,
Right.
and that's why I think maybe a script doesn't actually work.
Hmm.
Is that accurate?
I'd say so. Yeah.
Because, like, yeah, I
Yeah.
can just say the words, but if I haven't done the self-reflection and the time to really to figure it out what it is that I need to be doing in the relationship and what it is that I need to take ownership of, then
Hmm.
no script is actually ever going to be effective.
Right. Right. Yeah, and so that's why, this question is a little bit tricky, where it's asking for what examples might sound like. I think, because I think it, like I was saying before, it kind of just depends. So let's take, I don't know if you want to like dive a little bit more in depth
Yeah,
with
let's dive
what
in.
something like this might
Like,
look like.
because I think the person asking this question is coming from a place where we all have probably been at some point in a
Right.
relationship of like,
Right.
what does this even look like?
Right.
How do
Right.
I navigate this moving forward? Or I've been burned in
Absolutely.
the past and I want to do this different, right?
Right.
And we don't know the full context of this question, but I think it would be really helpful maybe to just, and we can kind of make up a scenario maybe of what this
Hmm.
might look like in a make believe relationship.
Okay. Yeah. So let's say that there's a couple that is newly married, or let's say in a serious relation, let's say a serious relationship, and one person, has been upfront about struggling with pornography. Let's just use the stereotypical terms here. Let's say that the man is saying like, hey, I've struggled with this since I was a kid. And then the woman in the relationship, she feels, doesn't love it, but that there's been dialogue in the past about, okay, I know that you struggle with this. Where do we stand as a couple on this? I think a lot of times there's an assumption that both people think that pornography is not good and should never be consumed. And so when one person breaks this very unspoken contract, then it can get a little bit trickier. So I think it's important for any brand new couple where pornography is brought up of just to say like, well, what do we want this like, what do we want our relationship to be with pornography? So is it something that, if I know that you struggle, is it something that I'm okay if it happens once a month, once a year? Do we believe together that this is something that should never happen? I guess what I'm trying to say is it's making a decision as a couple. This is what we value in our relationship
Oh, I think this
rather
is
than,
so beautiful
yeah,
and so needed.
yeah, because otherwise it's like this weird unspoken, what's the right word? Like this weird unspoken contract that both of you have made, but maybe both of you haven't understood what the other person believes or what that is going to look like. So
Totally. And I would
I
even
think it's,
say that it
yeah,
would be important to define what you view as pornography.
yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
for
Great
both
point.
people, for both
Yeah.
parties, like what
Yeah.
you're okay with, like what do you view as being a breach of your trust in your relationship
Right.
in regards
Right.
to pornography use?
Right.
Yeah,
And I think with this conversation, what is the second half most important part of this is for the person that is struggling with pornography to be very honest about realistically what this is going to look like in the relationship. So this is different than saying like, well, I struggle and sorry, this is just going to be here. It's more of a like, I'm trying. I've been working with perhaps a therapist, or I this is something that I have been talking to my bishop about, or whatever it is. But despite all of this, I tend to slip up about once a month.
hmm,
And so I really don't want this to be part of a relationship. It's important to me that I continue to work on this, but I need to be honest that realistically, it's going to be a part of our relationship. Just
hmm.
because historically, like that's what history has shown us. Because then having a really upfront conversation like that allows her to then decide, okay, well, can I live with that? I'm aware he's working on this. I'm aware he's wanting to change and working towards change. But where he's at right now, this may happen once a month or once every other month. And can I handle that? So I think why this is crucial is because a lot of times where this betrayal idea comes in is when it feels like I didn't get a choice. I didn't get to make a choice in
Hmm.
this. I didn't like
Interesting.
there was no true honesty. I didn't get to choose. But if this conversation has happened, then she can say, I don't like this, but I knew, but I still made this choice.
Yeah.
And I mean, and with that, there's always a choice to leave if it's not getting any better, or if things continue to get worse, or whatever that may look like. I'm not saying because you chose once, you have to continue to choose for this relationship, but it is important I think that gives a sense of agency that then takes out some of that betrayal piece to it because there was agency.
Totally. And I think the honesty is very freeing, probably for both people, not
Yeah.
just the woman choosing into the relationship and being able to be like, oh, this is, and again, we're using the stereotypical
Right.
what this has historically usually been, but it could be either party. But what the woman choosing in, but also the man being honest with, like,
Hmm.
this has been the pattern. And I maybe the last like 3 months has been kind of like this beautiful period where we've been
Yeah.
dating and I haven't been struggling with
Right.
as much. But honestly, it might happen again.
Hmm.
And how are we going to moving forward?
Yeah. Well, and that's great because then it leads to the next part of the conversation where she can then have some time to figure out, is this something that I choose? But then also, okay, understanding this, what is it that, like, how do I want to show up in a relationship with someone that struggles with pornography? Is it that I'm going to say, okay, well, for every time that you do, this is going to be the consequence? That may not be the best relationship for them to be in. And this is again where it gets a little bit tricky, is because again, I'm not saying that it's just like a free pass. Well, this is something he struggles with, and like, oh well, I guess I have to just deal with it. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying though is when we're setting boundaries to be consequences, like, okay, every time you do this, then I'm going to, then I like it, like let's say she says, if you do this 3 times, then I'm out of this relationship. That's more of a consequence rather than boundary, because my guess is that comes more from a place of anxiety rather than a peaceful place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so what I hear you saying is that the boundary needs to be less about what's going to happen to the other person and maybe more about what you need in order to continue to regulate yourself and your
Hmm.
emotions in the relationship moving forward. Is that
Yeah, yeah,
like
absolutely.
because I mean, I'm just imagining in this like how I would feel, right? First of
Hmm.
all, that would probably trigger all of the feelings of 12-year-old me who walked in on my dad relapsing
Yeah,
pornography and just
yeah.
like, oh my gosh, my
Mm,
world has ended. So I'm sure it would trigger so much fear and pain, even just having this conversation. And I would have to just own that. Like, I'd have to be like, okay, I need you to know that I'm like freaking out right now.
mhm,
And I'm trying not to run, but I want to run. And I'm just using myself as an example because that's who I know best. I just know that often in these conversations, but also moving forward when your boundaries are maybe tested or when there comes that conflict in maybe your agreements in your relationship,
mhm,
you're going to have things triggered that happened then, but also
mhm.
stuff like that's happened in your past, right?
Absolutely.
Whether that's something you observed in someone else's life or something that literally happened in your life, right? And
Right.
so I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think when it comes to setting a boundary, for me and what I've seen to be more effective is to be like, okay, if this happens, if you breach our agreement of no pornography in our relationship, if that's your agreement, then I'm going to need some space to process my feelings. And what that space looks like is
Mhm.
I'm going to need like 24 hours and maybe a trip to the temple
Right,
and like some chocolate. I don't know.
right.
Before we can even have another conversation about it, big.
Yeah, because I think along with this initial conversation where, he's being honest about where he's at with his struggle with pornography, it's now her turn to be honest with herself, but also with him. So really it's saying, okay, I'm understanding that it's likely that this is going to show up in my relationship. Like if that's monthly, yearly, or whatever it is, it's likely this is going to show up. Am I at a place right now where I feel like like, I can regulate around that? Because if the answer to that is no, and this is so triggering to me that I completely lose myself and I start to behave in a way that I do not respect, then I may not be ready for a relationship with somebody who struggles with pornography.
Oh, wow.
And
How beautiful to
and
have that kind of honest question to yourself.
yeah, and really in the end, actually, it's not about him. It's about her. It's about her saying, "I'm not ready." Like I hope to have a goal to work around this so that I can be regulated enough that a future partner could tell me that they're struggling, and or I have tools in my back pocket of helping me regulate when I'm dysregulated. That I feel confident that I'm not going to just like completely lose it when a disclosure happens. I think that's the absolute kindest thing that a couple could do for each other.
Hey, listener, if you missed the previous episode with Chandler Rogers, you definitely need to go back and listen to it. In the episode, Chandler shares how he finally found the courage to break free of the isolation that kept him trapped in his pornography habit. With the help of his accountability group, he was able to make lasting change. He then created Relay, a group recovery program to help you quit porn by making it easier to have effective accountability, self-care tools, and meaningful connection with your support group anytime you need it right on your phone. Definitely go and listen to my episode with Chandler, or use the link in the show notes to try Relay out for yourself so you don't have to go at this alone anymore.
If someone's saying, I have struggled or am struggling with pornography, and then saying, okay, but we together as a couple decide that there's going to be no pornography in this relationship. I think that we're setting ourselves up a little bit for failure, just because that's history has shown us that's probably not what's going to happen. And by that, I just mean like he could say, yeah, I've been in lots of relationships with other women who've also told me that they don't want me to struggle with this, and I still do. And so it's likely I'm going to here. So history is showing me that I'm likely still going to struggle in this relationship with pornography. Again, it's getting better. I'm working on it. Um, then, then it's having some level of, okay, so if I, as the woman, hear this, that this is likely going to be here, and I feel like I feel somewhat confident that I can regulate myself, then what is that going to look like? Again, and then this is where the boundaries come in. The boundaries come in way before the pornography happens. And it needs to come in at a time that is not already dysregulated. So if he comes in and says, hey, I had to slip up, and then she sets boundaries, again, that is going to be coming from an anxious place and probably quite disconnecting for both people. So
Right.
that's why when there are these calm conversations that are happening, and this is where boundaries are being set. So this might be something like, okay, when this happens, we together as a couple would like this to not be part of our relationship. However, if it does show up, then what I need, and going through this is what I'm going to need. So I'm going to need, and I like your example, like I'm going to need a little bit of time by myself to regulate. And so for me, regulation looks like maybe it's talking to a trusted one, maybe it's journaling, maybe it's going out to go for a hike. And I'm going to regulate myself. A lot of times when we have this idea of like I need space, that's more of a consequence than it is a boundary, because when we're just saying I need space, but I'm not doing anything in the meantime, I'm just going to let you stew in what you did and then you can come back to me and apologize. There's absolutely no growth for either person really in that. So
Right.
when the boundary is set of I'm gonna take some space, because one, I can't control you, so I can't make you give me space. So I'm gonna take some space, and I'm going to regulate so that I can come back and we can talk about how we can do better. What I'm, maybe own up to my stuff of like, wow, I snapped at you after you told me, and I'm really not proud of that, because I don't believe that anyone deserves, like, I don't respect that in myself. I don't respect unkindness. And so I apologize for the way that I responded when you told me. And that was really hard for me to hear. I'm feeling very disappointed, because that was something we talked about we didn't want in our relationship. So does that make sense? Like, so where
Yeah,
do we go from
and I
here?
love that you brought up the example because your emotions are valid. Like, and
Yeah.
I think it's very important that we're not trying to tell the partner who's maybe not in the struggle with pornography that your reaction is totally valid. Like
Hmm.
the feelings that you're going to feel totally valid. And
Right.
yes, you're probably going to be really frustrated and hurt and
Yeah.
discouraged and disappointed and
Right.
fill in the blank when when and if this happens, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's true of any disagreement or any breach of any agreement in a relationship, right? But
Right.
especially this one because it is so charged and often
Hmm.
connected to like our core and our hearts and our love and our insecurities, right?
Hmm.
And so I love that you brought up that you can own like, hey, I reacted in a way I didn't like, and I feel really hurt
Hmm.
and sad and disappointed, and how can we together move to moving better. I think that
Yeah.
that is such a beneficial thing because you owned where you are, you owned what maybe you want to change, but then you're working together for a better future.
Absolutely. Well, and with that, I think that there is a lot of power in the ownership of being, like, even to take a step further, if I'm her, of saying like, I don't like the way I snapped at you. I think I did that because this really taps at a very vulnerable part of me,
Mm.
a part that is afraid I'm not good enough for this relationship, or a part of me that is worried you don't find me desirable, or is worried, whatever it may be. And so this is a particularly touchy subject for me. And so that's my stuff. That exists way before I met you. but that's my stuff. And your choices have an impact on our relationship. So I think there's just a lot of power in owning, both people owning, because then he can come in and say like, absolutely, I don't really like that you did snap. I understand that you did, but I felt like it was particularly unkind to something that I felt was very vulnerable to share. And so in the future, I would appreciate it if it wasn't responded with such unkindness. And I get it. Like my struggle with this predates you, and like him explaining more about where that comes from him, or I feel like I'm immature in my development with my sexuality, and that's what draws me to pornography. I need to grow up around this, right? So like that type of ownership on both parts is going to be tremendously connecting for the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, even as you just describing this relationship or this conversation, I'm like, wow. Like I can just picture the couple embracing even as they're
Yeah.
like seeing these vulnerable, sensitive, honest parts of each other and how
Mhm.
at the end of the conversation they probably won't have a perfect solution. In fact,
Mm.
that was one of my thoughts. Probably you're not going to walk away feeling like it's fixed.
Right.
But I think you will walk away if you can get to this honesty. You're going to walk away from the conversation hand in hand, likely,
Yeah.
and maybe not literally hand in hand, but feeling so much more connected than you would be if it was just like, oh, well, here's your consequence. We are taking a break for like 3 weeks, or whatever,
Right. Right. Right.
So go ahead.
Well, and I was gonna say, I mean, that may be like the example you just gave may be a boundary that needs to be set of like, whew, like we're really breaching trust here. Like it's like an example like that may be like maybe you have this agreement that he will then come share with her when he has looked at pornography, and let's say that she finds out he hasn't been. For her to say like, one, I do not like I respect myself enough to not be in a relationship where someone is going to treat me this way. So I need some space to think about this. Like I think that's very fair and very valid. Again, it's not a punishment, but it's just saying like is it's taking that time to be very active about what is it that I need. Also, like what is it that I need to grow? Maybe my growth here is to have a level of respect for myself to say like I will not tolerate dishonesty, and that has been breached, and so therefore or whatever it looks like. So again, it's not about like what is the boundary or what is not the boundary. Going back to the beginning, it is why is that being said? What's happening while the boundary is in action?
Interesting. I feel like the more and more we talk about boundaries, it's really coming to an agreement of what are the values that you as an individual value in relationship with other, like your relational values, also as a couple. And if
Mm-hmm.
those are being breached and those aren't being honored, then you're going to know what to do in
Yeah.
order to move forward,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Right.
As you were talking about this, I just had this like flashback to a younger me who was in a
Mm-hmm.
relationship with a guy who was struggling, and I remember being devastated that our relationship was ending because I was like, man, of anyone, like I should be the one who could handle this. But really, I was like, you know what? I can't. I
Mm-hmm.
can't handle where he's at right now. And I
Mm-hmm.
realized it was the most freeing thing that I could do for both of us
Mm-hmm.
was to break up. And it was the most
Mm-hmm.
kind thing. Even though it didn't feel kind and it was like a part of me didn't want to, right? Because I was like, no, like we can I was like, no, like honestly, I can't handle it and I don't think he can handle it either
Mm-hmm.
currently.
Yeah.
And that relationship ended and it was hard, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
so grateful. I'm so grateful that I was honest with myself.
Mm-hmm.
And and because I mean, I think it saved both of us a lot of pain moving forward. And it's interesting because had we had this conversation, like had I like talked to you about this, I probably would have been like, "Oh, that was me setting a boundary." No, I that was me just like being honest
Mm-hmm.
and taking action on what felt right.
Mm-hmm.
and doing what was right by like me and by him, you know?
Mm,
And I think that that was like maybe an example of setting a boundary of just being like, you know what, this isn't working,
mhm.
and we both need something different. And again, that was in like a dating relationship. It would probably look different in a marriage relationship, right?
I mean, there's a level of commitment there. So
Right.
definitely. I think what is really important for, especially, so when there's like two parts of a relationship around pornography. There's the person that's struggling, and to that struggle, it really speaks to a level of extreme immaturity around relationships to themselves, to probably like their own emotionality or relationship with their sexuality. Like, honestly, pornography is understandable because we don't pressure ourselves as a culture to grow up
Hmm.
sexually, or to really mature into our sexual development. And so it makes sense that a lot of us stay stuck in a very immature relationship with it, which often shows up as pornography, especially for men. So
Interesting.
really that's what's happening for him,
Right.
is it's just he just kind of needs to grow up. But on the other end, and by grow up I just mean like really to develop, to develop relationships with himself and with other people. And anyway, so on the other end though, with a person, particularly a woman, who can get really reactive around pornography, it's also just important for her to do some work around this, because when we're coming at a place of gauging pornography, yeah, from a place of, well, this is threatening to me, as as in the way of, if he's looking at pornography, deep down I believe it's because I'm not desirable, or I'm not enough, or he's choosing, like, this is at some fault of me because I'm, yeah, I'm not enough. Then she needs to grow up around that,
Hmm. Yeah.
because like, objectively pornography is not going, like, pornography is not going to be, it's like candy, like it's not like it's not going to be adding anything to a healthy relationship or to a person. But we add such huge meanings from it, especially as women, where we see it as threatening to ourselves and our sense of self and our sense of worth. And when we just flip around and blame it on our partner, then we don't have to look at ourselves.
Interesting.
Then we're like put in a place of like, well, he's the one that's looking up porn, and that in our culture is not okay, so he's the one at fault. When really it's not putting pressure on her to grow around her relationship with herself, and why is it so activating?
Hmm.
Is there a way to have pornography be a little bit less weighted? Maybe a better word is catastrophized in a relationship. Because if she can say, hey, I know who I am, like, whether or not you decide to look at pornography, that is like, I just see it as immature, and I see it as, that's on you, that's not a reflection of me. Whew, she's going to respond a lot differently and be able to handle when he tells her he's struggling with pornography. Like, she's probably not going to like it, and maybe even she say won't tolerate it because I don't like what it, I don't like what it does to you, or I don't like how you then show up in a relationship, or whatever it looks like. But it's not coming out of a place of insecurity in me.
Yeah, that is so beautiful. And I think such an interesting and profound invitation for each of us to look at, where are we? What is it that's motivating our actions? And where do I need to grow up in my motivations
Mm-hmm.
and in my core values and in
Mm-hmm.
my actions? Like where is it that I need to take ownership, and where is it that I need to move and change in a way
Mm-hmm.
that will actually help me connect with people as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to shift the responsibility or escape.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And unfortunately, we, like, pornography is actually a really rich, I hate to say this, I probably could say this better, but I'm just going to say it poorly. But pornography can be a really rich opportunity for especially a woman in a partnership, to grow.
Hmm.
For her to say, okay, like this is exposing a lot of very painful parts of my insecurities.
Yeah.
And I wish this wasn't here because I don't agree with what pornography stands for. I don't find it appealing. I think that it's causing a lot of damage in our society. But I'm going to use this opportunity to pressure myself to grow
Hmm.
so that I can see clearly how to move forward in this relationship. Because then it's not coming from a place of anxiety, it's coming from a very clear place where I see, can say, look, what, like this has nothing to do with me, your struggle. But I would like to be with someone who's more grown up around this
Hmm.
or has a better sense of their relationship with their sexuality with themselves. And unfortunately, you're just not quite there. I remember there's one guy in particular, the things that he thought were funny were so juvenile to me, where he was showing me videos of cartoons that my brothers watched when we were 12. And he just thought it was super hilarious. And so in my mind, I was like, this guy's kind of stuck in a 12-year-old. He just feels really young and immature to me. And so I'm not really interested in that. I would like someone to be where I'm at and my level of maturity around, X, Y, or Z. And so when it comes to sexuality and, if she's really done the work to accept herself as a sexual being, does not have that anxiety around it, then she may be able to, like, I think it's very fair for her to expect or pressure her partner to get to that same space just to grow up a little bit and to mature.
Well, and I'd even say that her being in that space will be an invitation for her partner to meet her
Yeah.
in that space,
Yeah.
right? I feel like that likes attracts, right? There's the old adage of like, make a list of who you want to be with and then become that list, right? I
Hmm.
feel like that gets around. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. If
Hmm.
you do the work personally, and that's what's so empowering about this conversation is that there's so much you can do no matter which side of the conversation
Right.
you're on. And the
Right.
more work that you do on yourself, the better your relationship will be.
Exactly. Exactly. Because really, in the end, when you have two very people who are immature around sex and sexuality, she's very anxious about him needing to validate her that she's desirable. And he's also very anxious because he's anxious about being a sexual being. Like they're both just kind of at the opposite end of anxiety. So when she really grows up and holds on to a sense of self around that, then she can easier see and pick out, like, I'm not attracted to the immaturity that can come with pornography.
And going back to the story that I shared just from my own dating experience,
Hmm.
what I felt was really beautiful and I'm so grateful is that I realized in that relationship that it wasn't what I wanted, and
Hmm.
I felt like ultimately I wasn't breaking up with him because of pornography, I was breaking up with him
Hmm.
because pornography was a symptom of, like, who he was, and
Yeah.
I was like, "You know
Yeah.
what? This isn't gonna work."
Right.
And
Right.
and and I hope that you figure out your life, you know?
Hmm.
And I'm gonna go figure out my life, and I did so much work with a therapist,
Hmm.
and I did so much work just by myself, and and I became a better person, and by my next relationship, which just happened to be my husband, I was in such a better place because I had done the work
Right.
and continue to do the work, right? Like
Right.
it's not
Absolutely.
like, oh, sweet, I met George and we're good.
Right.
No, but I think that there's so much to be said about boundaries being a matter of respect, a respect for ourselves, a respect
Hmm.
for the other person, and
Absolutely.
it becoming very clear we when we get honest about how can I respect you and how can you respect me moving forward.
Hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything else you want to share about boundaries as maybe we wrap this up?
Well, I will say that we often talk about how important boundaries are. And I think women in particular, men and women, are really, really struggle to set boundaries. There's this feeling of like, I don't want to, like, yeah, I know it's good, but I don't want him to say anything that where he doesn't like me anymore, or I don't want to hurt his feelings or her feelings. And so recognizing that the mark of healthy relationships is that there are healthy boundaries.
Hmm.
Because when there are healthy boundaries in place, then to me, what I see is just two humans that respect each other.
Hmm.
And it really is somewhat of teaching someone else how to be in a relationship with you. Like, these are the things that are really important to me and that I value. And I respect myself enough to ask for this. And I expect to be respected that these are honored, especially when it comes to core values. Not values come out of anxiety, but true core values. So they're hard. They're very hard, and they are crucial for a relationship.
And so worth finding someone that you can have this mutual respect that you're talking
Absolutely.
about.
Yeah.
Because so worth it. It's
Hmm.
so worth doing the inner work to be able to have the respect for other people and yourself, to
Right.
be able to hold boundaries like you're describing.
Yeah. Exactly.
So worth it. And it does. It's hard because it requires you to be fully engaged and fully
Hmm.
present
Hmm.
and fully responsible for your
Hmm.
actions. But I think, oh man, talk about a relationship worth having,
Right.
as opposed to just
Exactly.
like staying stuck and
Right.
or repeating the past, repeating the
Hmm.
relationships that you saw that maybe you didn't like growing up, and here you are recreating it because you didn't take the time to grow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to end with this because I think it's like a good gauge is well, it can be tempting to allow behaviors to play out or play out behaviors on our own and be resentful and stay resentful, because I think resentfulness can feel powerful sometimes. But when we show up vulnerably and give boundaries, really in the end, it's like for me, I just respect myself more when I don't stay stuck in resentment, but I speak up and share what's going on for me, and if needs be, both of us are giving boundaries to each other. I just find that I respect myself more. And so I guess that's a question of I ask myself is how I'm behaving, do I respect? And if the answer to that is no, because I'm stuck in resentment, then it's time for me to speak up.
Oh, beautifully said. Beautifully said. Listeners, if you've had anything come to mind, or maybe a relationship where you're like, man, I want to up my respect in that relationship, or something, that take action on it. Take action on whatever has come to mind. And I promise God will help you as you take action, but also you will find greater connection on the other side. You will find greater love, greater compassion, and greater healing for yourself as you have courage in taking action on
Mhm.
any thought or insight or invitation that you have felt today. Thank you so much, Rachel. I
Yeah,
am
thank you for
so
having
grateful
me.
for this conversation. I think it's such a beautiful one because it felt so much different than boundary conversations of the past.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, I hope. I mean, it was a good reminder for me, for
Definitely.
myself in my own life. Yeah.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of things I'm like, I'm going to be taking action
Right.
differently moving forward.
Right.
Yes. Yes. Oh, so agree. Well, thank you so much. If this podcast has helped or inspired you, please take a moment and rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and share this episode with someone you love. Use the link in the show notes if you have a question you would love to have answered in our Ask a Therapist series. If you or someone you know is done trying to quit porn and change on their own, Relay is for you. Use the link in our show notes to download the app and go listen to the previous episode where Chandler shares his story and all about Relay, an app designed to help you change with the support you need. Thank you for listening to Breaking the Silence by Reach 10. Break the silence and help us create a culture of courage and compassion by sharing what you learned today with someone you love. Help us reach more people by rating and reviewing us on iTunes or liking and leaving a comment on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Reach 10 is a nonprofit. You can help support this podcast by donating on our website and following us on social media. We share these views to open the dialogue and educate on these tough issues and to create a healthier culture of sexuality. The opinions and views shared by the host or guests do not constitute as professional advice or services and do not necessarily reflect the views of Reach 10. We do not guarantee the accuracy of any statements you hear. Reach 10 is not responsible for your use of information heard in this podcast. We keep learning and invite you to join us as we build a more open, compassionate, and courageous culture. Keep breaking the silence.